The crack was a sound both sharp and wet, a thunderclap in the cathedral of commerce. It was the sound of bone meeting bone, of arrogance given physical form, of a line being crossed from which there could be no retreat. It echoed through the cavernous, sun-drenched food court of the Beverly Center, a percussive punctuation mark in the symphony of 1,000 banal conversations, the clatter of trays, and the distant, synthesized melodies of mall pop. For a frozen second, the world held its breath. The hum of capitalism faltered. A fork loaded with kung pao chicken paused halfway to her mouth. A laugh died in a teenager's throat. Then the held breath was released in a collective gasp, a sound like the tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind a silence pregnant with shock. Richard Morrison's fist, still clenched, trembled with the ghost of the impact. The knuckles of his right hand, adorned with a signet ring bearing his family's meaningless crest, throbbed with a triumphant fire. He watched, his chest puffed out like a pouter pigeon, as David Williams staggered back a step, then two. David's hand, long-fingered and elegant, rose instinctively to his jaw, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed utterly out of sync with the violence just inflicted upon it. He didn't cry out. He didn't curse. His dark eyes, deep and startlingly, simply held Richard's, and in their depths, Richard saw not fear or pain, but a flicker of something he couldn't name. It was a serene and ancient curiosity, the look of a geologist examining a common rock, unaware that it was about to be a part of an earthquake. Learn to stay in your place. The words ripped from Richard's throat, loud, brutish, and theatrical. He was performing now, playing to the gallery that was already forming. A spontaneous theater in the round of horrified, fascinated onlookers. He smoothed the lapels of his Tom Ford suit, a gesture of self-reassurance, a physical reminder of his own importance, his own station. People like you shouldn't even be here. Around them, the modern world reacted as it always does. The gasp gave way to the rustle of 100 hands digging into 100 pockets and purses. A forest of smartphones bloomed, their dark, cyclopean lenses turning from passive observers into active participants. Hungry little eyes eager to capture, consume, and disseminate the unfolding drama. Children, their innocence shattered by the sudden adult rage, began to cry, their high-pitched wails a mournful counterpoint to the excited murmurs of the crowd. A circle was forming, a ring of judgment and spectacle, trapping the perpetrator and his victim in a shared, unwilling spotlight. David Williams was 34 years old. He had walked through corridors of power that Richard Morrison could only dream of. He had negotiated deals that could buy and sell the entire platinum fashion chain a dozen times over. He had stared down men whose quiet threats could make governments tremble. He had never, in his entire adult life, imagined that a simple, sunlit, afternoon trip to the mall to buy his wife a birthday present, a ridiculously expensive, yet beautiful handbag he'd seen online, would culminate in this primal, public humiliation. He tasted blood, a coppery temp spreading like a stain across his tongue. He gently probed the inside of his cheek with his tongue, feeling the torn flesh. He regained his balance, planting his feet in their unassuming, comfortable sneakers, and kept his gaze locked on Richard. The chaos swelled around him, the pointing fingers, the hushed whispers, the weeping children, but at the center of the storm, David felt a profound and disturbing stillness settle over him. It was a familiar feeling, a dangerous friend from a lifetime ago. It was the calm of the hunter, the patience of the strategist, the quiet that descends just before the meticulously planned checkmate. That it had all begun 15 minutes earlier, with a quiet word and a wall of polite, impenetrable prejudice. David had approached the gleaming glass doors of the Platinum Fashion Boutique, a temple of haute couture where handbags cost more than a reliable used car. He knew what he wanted, the Serafina clutch in midnight blue, Elena's favorite color. He had the item number memorized. He was ready to be in and out in 5 minutes, a simple transaction. But he never made it past the threshold. A security guard, a hulking man whose suit seemed a size too small for his formidable frame, had stepped in his way, blocking the entrance with an apologetic, yet firm, posture. Behind him, standing near a display of jewel-toned scarves, was Richard Morrison, the regional manager, a man whose arrogance preceded him like a foul cologne. Richard had given the guard a short, sharp nod, a silent command. "Sorry, sir," the guard had mumbled, his eyes avoiding David's. "But this store, it isn't for your type of customer." The phrase hung in the air-conditioned atmosphere, as ugly and out of place as a pile of garbage in an art gallery. Your type of customer. David had heard variations of it before, subtle and overt, whispered and shouted. It was a ghost that had haunted him his entire life. From the corner stores of his childhood to the country clubs of his adulthood, he met the guard's averted gaze with a level, non-threatening calm. "My type?" David had asked, his voice even and polite, betraying none of the weariness that settled in his bones. "I'm not sure I understand. Could you clarify what type that is?" That was when Richard had decided to intervene personally. He strode forward, his expensive leather shoes clicking an aggressive rhythm on the polished marble floor. His smile was a thin, condescending slash across his face. "You know exactly what it means," Richard had sneered, his voice carrying a note of smug satisfaction. He relished these moments, these opportunities to enforce the natural order of things, to remind the world of the invisible walls that separated the worthy from the unworthy. He gestured dismissively at David's attire, the soft, jeans, the simple gray t-shirt, the sneakers that were built for comfort, not for status. "This is a designer boutique, my friend. Our products, our art, costs more than you likely make in a year, probably more than you've made in your entire life. Now, stop wasting our time and our customers' oxygen. Go find something more suited to your budget. I hear the discount outlets are having a sale." The employees behind the counter, a pair of young women with identical nervous expressions, shrank back, suddenly finding the floor fascinating. They had seen Mr. Morrison in this mode before. It was always ugly, always unnecessary, but he was the boss. His cruelty was the price of their employment. David had simply held his ground. "I understand the price of your products," he had replied, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "I saw a bag online I'd like to purchase for my wife. It's her birthday." "Your wife?" Richard had laughed, a short barking sound devoid of any real humor. "Let me guess. She wants a knockoff from a street vendor. We don't sell fakes here, we are the genuine article." The insult, so blatant and dripping with racial and class-based venom, was the final straw. David, ever the strategist, knew when a conversation had reached its terminal point. He also knew that a public corporation like Platinum Fashion had policies, codes of conduct, and a vested interest in not having their regional managers behave like petty tyrants from a bygone era. "I'd like your name, please," David had said, his tone shifting from polite inquiry to something colder, more official. "And the name of your superior. I'd like to file a formal complaint with your corporate office about this customer service experience." That was the spark. The request for his name, the threat of accountability, was an affront to Richard's sense of absolute authority within his marble-floored fiefdom. His carefully constructed facade of smug superiority cracked, revealing the insecure, raging bully beneath. "You want my name?" Richard had spat, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. He had taken a step closer, invading David's personal space. "You're in no position to demand anything from me. You are trespassing. I'm asking you to leave. I'm a potential customer attempting to enter a public place of business." David had corrected him calmly. "I haven't broken any laws. You, however, are engaging in discriminatory practices." The word discriminatory was a red flag to the bull. Richard's eyes bulged. He had shoved David a hard two-handed push to the chest. "Get out of my store." "No." The commotion had spilled out from the boutique's entrance into the wider expanse of the mall. Shoppers had turned to look. It was this, the feeling of being watched, that had pushed Richard over the edge. He needed to reassert his dominance, to make an example of this man who dared to challenge him, who dared to use words like discriminatory. In his presence, he had followed David out into the open, shouting, gesticulating, his rage building to a crescendo, and then, in the middle of the food court, fueled by a toxic cocktail of prejudice, insecurity, and a desperate need to feel powerful, he had swung. And now, here they stood, in the aftermath of that crack, the world rushing in to fill the vacuum. Richard was still preening, still performing for the cameras. David was simply standing, wiping a smear of blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes, those unnervingly serene eyes, held a story no one in that crowd could have read. They didn't see the boy who had learned to read people's intentions in the flicker of an eye on the tough streets of Detroit, where a wrong look could be a death sentence. They didn't see the teenager who had taught himself to code on a junk computer, building a digital fortress to escape the chaos of his reality. They didn't see the young man who had worked 3 jobs to put himself through college, who had faced down condescending professors and dismissive peers, his quiet brilliance a weapon they never saw coming. They didn't see the man who had built an empire from scratch, a titan of technology whose name was whispered with reverence in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street, a man whose innovations powered the very phones that were now recording his humiliation. They saw only what Richard Morrison saw, a black man in plain clothes, in a place where Richard believed he didn't belong. What none of them could possibly imagine, what Richard in his blind, suffocating arrogance could never conceive, was that this seemingly vulnerable man, this victim of his casual brutality, held a secret. It was a secret not of wealth, but of power so vast and interconnected, that it touched every single person in that mall, including Richard himself. And Richard Morrison, regional manager of Platinum Fashion, a man who believed himself to be a gatekeeper of luxury and status, had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. He hadn't just punched a man, he had pushed the first domino in a line that would lead directly to the utter destruction of his own carefully curated world. The universe, David knew, had a funny, brutal way of balancing its books, and the bill for this particular transgression was about to come due. The smile on Richard Morrison's face was one of pure, unadulterated triumph. He felt magnificent. He was a gladiator in the Colosseum of commerce, having just vanquished a barbarian at the gates. The growing circle of onlookers, with their phones held aloft like votive candles, were his adoring public. He mistook their shock for awe, their morbid curiosity for approval. He was the hero of this story, the defender of decency and decorum. "Did you all see that?" he boomed, his voice resonating with self-importance. He pointed a finger at David, who was now calmly inspecting the blood on the back of his hand, as if it were a curious specimen under a microscope. "That is how we deal with intruders here at the Beverly Center. This is a place for people of quality, people of substance, not for any piece of trash who decides to wander in from the streets." Near the entrance to the now-forgotten Platinum Fashion boutique, the security guard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His name was Marcus, a man of 53 with kind eyes and a back that ached from 15 years of standing on hard marble floors. He was also a black man. He stared at the ground, a profound sense of shame washing over him. He had seen it, all the polite inquiry, the manager's escalating aggression, the unnecessary shove, the final, cowardly punch. It was brutal. It was wrong. But Richard Morrison signed his paychecks, indirectly. The security company he worked for had the contract for the entire wing, and appeasing the managers of the high-end stores was an unspoken part of his job description. Jobs weren't easy to come by for a man his age with his skill set. Fear and necessity formed a cold, hard knot in his stomach. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus began, his voice low and hesitant, trying to de-escalate, to pull his boss back from the precipice. Maybe we should just call more security. Let them handle this in a more what, Marcus?" Richard snapped, turning on him, his eyes flashing with irritation. The interruption had broken his flow, his glorious moment of righteous victory. "More polite, you should be thanking me. I'm protecting our store, our brand, from undesirable elements, people who bring down the whole atmosphere." He gestured dramatically toward David again, as if presenting evidence to a jury. "Look at him, just look at the state of him. Faded jeans, cheap sneakers, there's no expensive watch, no signet ring, no indication that he could afford so much as a leather-scented air freshener from our store. I just saved our staff the trouble of having to tell him to his face that he doesn't belong." Marcus winced. He saw David's clothes, yes, but he also saw the man wearing them, and what he saw bothered him deeply. It was the eyes. It wasn't the anger of a man unjustly assaulted, nor the humiliation of a man publicly shamed. It wasn't even the fear of a man outnumbered and cornered. It was a preternatural calm, an unnerving stillness. It was the quiet confidence of a chess master who sees the entire board, who understands that the capture of a single pawn can be the beginning of a trap that will inevitably lead to the fall of the king. Marcus had been around powerful people, his whole life: celebrities, CEOs, politicians who shopped at the mall. The truly powerful ones, he had learned, never had to shout. Their power was a quiet gravity that bent the world around them, and he felt that gravity emanating from David Williams, a quiet, immense force that Richard was too blind and too loud to perceive. What Richard, in his ignorance, couldn't possibly know was that David Williams's entire life had been a map in turning disadvantage into strength, prejudice into fuel. He had grown up on the forgotten streets of Detroit, in a neighborhood where the wail of sirens was the nightly lullaby and survival was a full-time job. At 12 years old, while other kids were learning algebra, David was learning the complex calculus of street politics, learning that the loudest man in the room was almost always the weakest. He learned that fights weren't won with fists and fury, but with intelligence, observation, and an almost inhuman level of patience. At 15 he discovered the magic of code, a world of pure logic where the color of his skin didn't matter, a world where the elegance of his algorithms was the only thing that defined him. At 20, when a full-ride scholarship to Stanford became his ticket out, he made a vow to himself. He swore he would build a life so solid, so successful, so honest, that the gratuitous violence and casual bigotry of the world could never again define his destiny. He would build a fortress not of brick and mortar, but of achievement and influence. You know what bothers me the most? Richard continued his public tirade, intoxicated by the attention, his voice dripping with condescension. It's the arrogance, the sheer unmitigated gall. He really thought he could just stroll into my store, a place of elegance and refinement, and pretend he had the money, pretend he had the class, and that we would all just fall for his little charade. An elderly woman in the crowd, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, shook her head, her expression one of deep disapproval. "Young man," she said, her voice thin but clear, "there was no call for that. You didn't have to hit the boy. He wasn't doing anything wrong." Richard let out a dismissive laugh. He turned to her, his smile patronizing. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't understand the rarefied world of luxury goods. It's not just about selling products. It's about curating an experience. We have a duty to protect our real customers from embarrassing situations, from having to share their air with people who don't belong. Imagine if one of our regular clients, say, the wife of a studio executive, walked into the store and found this." He pointed at David again, his lip curling in disgust, loitering around. It would shatter the illusion. It would devalue the brand. It was at that moment that David finally decided to speak. His voice was low, not a shout, but it was imbued with a strange resonance, an authority that cut through the noise of the food court like a scalpel. Several people in the crowd instinctively leaned forward, straining to hear Mr. Morrison. The sound of his own name, spoken with such calm, unnerving precision, made Richard frown. It was a small thing, but it was the first chink in his armor of arrogance. He hadn't introduced himself. His name tag was tucked safely beneath the lapel of his suit jacket. A flicker of unease, cold and unwelcome, danced up his spine. David continued, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "I see that many of these people are filming this entire situation. For social media, no doubt. Are you quite certain that this is the image Platinum Fashion wants to project to the world? That this is the curated experience you want associated with your brand?" The question, so calm, so strategic, caught Richard completely off guard. This wasn't the reaction of a victim. This was the move of an opponent. How do you know my name?" Richard demanded, a slight tremor of uncertainty now coloring his voice. He tried to cover it with a blustering tone, but the damage was done. The first seed of doubt had been planted. A small, enigmatic smile touched David's lips. It was not a smile of fear, or submission, or even forgiveness. It was the smile of a predator that has just watched its prey walk willingly into a perfectly laid trap. Marcus, the security guard, saw that smile and felt a genuine chill. He took an involuntary step backward. He knew, with the certainty of a man who has seen too much of the world, that this was the moment everything changed. "Let's just say," David replied, his voice a smooth, calm river flowing through the chaotic landscape of the food court, "that I have a habit of being well informed about the people I intend to do business with." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, "and especially about people who make unilateral decisions that could potentially affect the reputation, and indeed the stock price, of a publicly traded company." The words business, stock price, publicly traded company were so out of place, so alien to the scene of primal violence that had just occurred, that they momentarily stunned Richard into silence. He felt that uncomfortable chill again, stronger this time, but his pride, his arrogance, was a formidable fortress. He quickly rallied, dismissing the feeling as absurd. This was ridiculous. It was Richard Morrison, a man of stature, a regional manager. This man before him was a nobody, an interloper, probably unemployed, or, at best, some low-level clerk trying to intimidate him with empty, important-sounding words he'd probably heard on television. "You don't scare me," Richard blustered, though his voice had lost its confident, booming quality. It was thinner now, readier, "and if you think you can threaten me after trying to barge into my store, you are sorely mistaken." Marcus, he turned to the security guard, his voice sharp with command, "Call all security, right now. I want this man removed from the premises immediately. I'll have him charged with trespassing and harassment." But Marcus didn't move. He was paralyzed, caught between the loud, blustering power of the man who could get him fired and the quiet, terrifying power of the man who had just been assaulted. All of his survival instincts, honed over decades of dealing with the rich and the powerful, were screaming at him. They were screaming that Richard Morrison had just kicked a hornet's nest, believing it to be a harmless paper bag. And the hornets were coming. The crowd, sensing the shift in dynamics, had grown even larger and quieter. The voyeuristic excitement was being replaced by a palpable, nervous tension. Every insult Richard had hurled, every gesture of contempt, it had not been a display of his own power, but a calibration of David's response. David had absorbed it all, cataloguing each word, each action, with the dispassionate focus of a scientist. For years he had cultivated patience as a weapon, understanding that true power was not in the immediate, emotional reaction, but in the long, strategic game. Richard thought he was winning a street fight. He had no idea he was a pawn in a corporate takeover. Just as Marcus finally made a move to reach for his radio, David calmly, almost casually, took his own phone out of his pocket. It was a simple gesture, so natural and unhurried that it seemed to mock the frantic energy radiating from Richard. "Excuse me," David said politely to the air, his thumb swiping across the screen and dialing a number from his contacts. I just need to make a quick call. It won't take a moment." "You're not calling anyone," Richard exploded, his composure completely gone. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the phone from David's hand. "Enough of this charade. Security, get over here now." David, with the easy grace of a trained athlete, simply took a half step back, effortlessly keeping the phone out of Richard's desperate reach. He turned his shoulder slightly, shielding the device, and spoke into it with a voice that was as calm and clear as a bell. The crowd pressed in, a silent, multi-headed beast, eager to hear. "Hello, Catherine, it's David." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. Richard, red-faced and panting from his lunge, froze. The name meant nothing to him. "Yes, I'm at the Beverly Center right now, as a matter of fact. Well, I'm having a bit of a situation here, right outside Platinum Fashion. A situation I thought you might want to know about." Another pause. David's expression remained serene, but a hint of something irony, perhaps, or a deep, abiding sadness flickered in his eyes. Richard, meanwhile, was growing more and more agitated by this calm, infuriating performance. "Catherine," he shouted, trying to project an authority he no longer felt. "Who the hell is Catherine? Is that your girlfriend, your mama? Is someone coming to pick you up in their beat-up Honda Civic?" David smiled again, that same disturbing, knowing smile that made Marcus's blood run cold. He looked directly at Richard, his eyes holding a universe of meaning. "Catherine Morrison," he said, pronouncing the last name with a deliberate, surgical precision. "I believe the two of you are quite well acquainted, Richard. In fact, if I recall correctly, she mentioned you two had a lunch meeting just last week to discuss quarterly performance reviews." The name Catherine Morrison didn't just hit Richard like a bolt of lightning. It was a tactical nuclear strike on the center of his universe. Catherine Morrison, his wife of 15 years, the director of human resources at a major tech firm, his partner, his confidant, the mother of his 2 children. He felt the blood drain from his face. His mind reeled, trying to process the impossible intersection of the 2 worlds he inhabited, the world where he was a husband and father, and the world where he was a petty tyrant in a luxury goods store. The two had just collided with the force of a supernova. How could this nobody know his wife, know her name, know about their lunch? It was impossible. It had to be a trick, a lucky guess, a bluff. You don't know my wife," Richard stammered, but the words were hollow, a paper shield against a tidal wave. His conviction had utterly evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. And then, a new voice cut through the murmuring of the crowd. It was a woman's voice, crisp, clear, and laced with concern. A voice Richard knew better than his own. "David, honey, where are you? I just got out of my meeting. The traffic was insane." The voice was getting closer. Richard turned, his movements slow and robotic, as if moving through deep water. He felt his legs threaten to give way. Walking purposefully toward them, her eyes scanning the crowd, was Catherine Morrison. She was a vision of corporate power, dressed in the navy blue executive suit he had helped her pick out that very morning. Her normally warm blue eyes were narrowed, flashing with a mixture of confusion and concern that was rapidly hardening into something else, something Richard had never seen directed at him before. It was an icy, controlled fury. "Catherine," Richard whispered, his own voice a stranger to his ears. The world had tilted on its axis. He was completely, utterly lost. What are you doing here? How do you know this? This man." Catherine's eyes finally found David. Her expression of concern deepened as she took in his stance, the protective hand still near his jaw, the circle of gawking strangers. She strode the last few feet, her heels clicking in ominous rhythm, and without a moment's hesitation, she wrapped David in a tight, loving embrace. The entire crowd murmured in unison, a wave of collective surprise. She pulled back, her hands on his shoulders, her eyes searching his face. "Are you okay?" Your voice on the phone sounded off. Her words caught in her throat as her gaze fell upon the small, still bleeding cut at the corner of David's mouth, and the angry red mark that was beginning to blossom on his jawline. Her face, which had been a mask of concern, transformed. It became a mask of cold, hard rage. She looked up from David's injury, her gaze sweeping over the scene until it landed on her husband. "Who did this to you?" Catherine asked. Her voice was dangerously quiet, but it carried an authority that made several people in the crowd instinctively take a step back. David didn't speak. He simply, calmly, lifted a finger and pointed directly at Richard, who stood frozen, his mind a howling vortex of denial and terror, desperately trying to reconcile the impossible reality unfolding before him. "Richard Morrison," David said, his voice as neutral and formal as if he were making introductions at a business conference. "Regional manager of Platinum Fashion. He seems to have formed the opinion that I do not possess the correct profile to enter his store." He then chose to express that opinion with his fists. Catherine turned her head slowly, her neck seemingly carved from ice, until her laser-like gaze was fixed upon her husband. Richard felt the world crumble and turn to dust around him. The expression on his wife's face was one he had never seen before. It was the look of a person staring at a complete and utter stranger, a monster she had somehow mistaken for a man. 15 years, Catherine said, her voice so low that only Richard, David, and those closest to them could hear the tremor of betrayal running through it. 15 years of marriage, Richard. 15 years of building a life, a family. And I truly thought I knew you, Catherine. "No, you don't understand," Richard began, his words tumbling out in a desperate, panicked torrent. "This man, he tried to force his way into my store. He was aggressive, he was threatening. I was protecting my employees, protecting the brand, protecting." Catherine's voice rose, sharp and brittle as breaking glass. She cut him off, her eyes blazing. "Protecting it from what, exactly?" "From a man trying to buy a birthday present for his wife." Marcus, the security guard, who had been watching the entire interaction with a growing sense of vindication and dread, finally found his voice. He knew he was taking a risk, but he also knew he had to speak the truth. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, stepping forward slightly, "if I may, your husband attacked this gentleman without any provocation. I saw the whole thing." Mr. David was calm and polite. He simply wanted to come into the store to make a purchase. "Who asked for your opinion, Marcus?" Richard snarled, turning on him, a cornered animal lashing out at the nearest target. But his authority had completely disintegrated. His words were hollow, pathetic. "You work for me." "Actually," a new official-sounding voice interjected. A man in a crisp mall security supervisor's uniform had pushed his way through the crowd. His badge was prominently displayed, and his face was set in grim, professional lines. "He works for the mall which holds the contract with Platinum Fashion, and we've just received no fewer than a dozen calls about a manager physically assaulting a member of the public in the food court." David watched the scene unfold with the quiet patience of a playwright, watching his actors perform their lines exactly as he had written them. The gears of consequence were turning, slowly, inexorably. Catherine moved to his side again, her hand finding his big fingers lacing together with a natural, practiced familiarity that sent a fresh spear of jealousy and dread through Richard's heart. "Richard," Catherine said, her voice now cold, firm, and professional. The voice of the HR director about to terminate an employee. "You assaulted David Williams." "David Williams, my best friend since we were freshmen in college. David Williams, who was the best man at our wedding. David Williams, whose brilliant wife, Alina, has been my business partner for the last 3 years. David Williams, the man who is the godfather to our children, Sophie and Leo." Each revelation was a hammer blow, systematically smashing the foundations of Richard's world. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place, forming a picture of his own spectacular, irreversible ruin. Best friend, best man, godfather. The connections were not just casual, they were foundational to the very structure of his family, his life. But he was dressed so Richard stammered, his mind grasping for a justification. Any justification, however flimsy. He stopped, realizing with dawning horror that every word he spoke was just digging his own grave deeper. "So what, Richard?" Catherine pressed, her voice merciless. "So what? So normal. So much like an ordinary person who isn't defined by the labels on his clothes. so much like a man who has come to a shopping mall to do some shopping. Tell me, Richard, what crime did he commit in your eyes, other than being a black man wearing casual clothes in a space you decided was yours to police? The crowd around them was a wall of silent judgment. The phones were still recording, capturing every agonizing second of Richard Morrison's public vivisection. The security supervisor was speaking quietly but urgently into his radio, his words punctuated by static. Backup was on the way. David finally spoke again, his voice still holding that unnatural, unnerving calm that had been his shield and his weapon throughout the entire ordeal. Richard, he said, and the use of his first name now felt like a final, intimate twist of the knife. When you barred me from entering your store today, and more pointedly, when you chose to resort to physical violence, you made two fundamentally incorrect assumptions. Richard stared at him, his mouth agape, unable to form a coherent thought, let alone a response. First, David continued, his voice a lesson in calm deliberation, you assumed, based on my appearance and the color of my skin, that I possessed neither the financial resources to be a customer nor the social connections to challenge your authority. Second, you assumed that I did not have the power, in any sense of the word, to defend myself. He paused, letting the words sink into the thick, tense air. Both of those assumptions, as you are now beginning to understand, were profoundly, catastrophically in error. Catherine squeezed David's hand, a small, firm gesture of solidarity. In that simple touch, Richard saw the truth of 20 years of shared history, of loyalty, of a bond deeper and more real than anything he had ever shared with his own wife. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, his own place in the world, was being systematically dismantled and rewritten before his very eyes. What you don't seem to understand, Richard, David said, his voice softening, with a trace of something that might have been pity, is that Catherine and I have known each other for 2 decades. She was the one who helped me edit my application essays, the ones that got me my first scholarship to Stanford. I was the one who introduced her to the man she would eventually marry. He locked his eyes onto Richard's, and delivered the final, devastating line of this act. That man was you. The revelation struck Richard with the force of a physical blow, knocking the last of the air from his lungs. The woman he loved, the woman he had built his life with, was the best friend of the man he had just assaulted and humiliated in the most public way imaginable. The architect of his happiness was also the architect of his doom. But just as Richard was struggling to process this soul-crushing information, David made a final, unexpected move. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small, discreet digital audio recorder. With an audible click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence, he turned it off. Catherine, David said calmly, slipping the device back into his pocket. Do you remember that conversation we had last week? About documenting clear, unambiguous instances of consumer racial discrimination for Elena's new research project on implicit bias in the luxury retail sector. He gave a small, sad smile. Well, I believe I've just collected a particularly enlightening, and I suspect, legally actionable, piece of data. The chapter of Richard's life as a successful, respected man was over. The click of the recorder was its final damning period, and in the stunned silence that followed, a new chapter, one of consequence and reckoning, was just beginning. The click of the digital recorder turning off was a sound more final than a gunshot. It was the sound of a cage door swinging shut, of a verdict being rendered. In the tense, ringing silence that followed, Richard Morrison felt a cold sweat, slick and nauseating, trickle down his spine. He had not merely assaulted a man, he had, with his own 2 hands, meticulously documented his own humiliation. He had provided the evidence, the motive, and the confession, all in one neat, horrifying package. Catherine, he stammered, his voice a ragged whisper, a desperate plea for a lifeline in the churning sea of his own making. You can't be serious. This is a misunderstanding. This man, he gestured wildly at David, his composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. He was aggressive. He forced his way into my store. I was just aggressive. Catherine's voice was like chipping ice. She turned to David, her expression a mixture of fury and a deep, wounded concern. David, show me exactly where Richard was aggressive toward you. David didn't need to say a word. He simply tilted his head slightly, presenting the irrefutable evidence. The cut on his lip, still oozing a tiny bead of blood. The angry, blossoming bruise on his jaw, a violent fingerprint left by Richard's signet ring. The physical proof was stark, undeniable, and, as David had so chillingly pointed out, captured for posterity on dozens of smartphones that were still steadfastly recording the entire implosion of Richard's life. 15 years, Richard, Catherine repeated, her voice shaking now, not with weakness, but with a contained seismic rage. 15 years, I have sat across the dinner table from you. I've listened to you lecture our children about values, about treating every person with respect, about being a man of character and integrity. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd, the silent jury of their peers, and in the space of a single ugly afternoon, you have pulled back the curtain and revealed the truth of who you really are: a bully, a bigot, a coward. The mall security supervisor, flanked now by 2 uniformed LAPD officers who had just arrived, pushed his way to the center of the circle. Their presence shifted the atmosphere from public drama to official incident. "Mr. Morrison," the supervisor said, his tone brooking no argument, "we need you to come with us. Several witnesses have already sent us their video recordings of the assault." Richard felt the world begin to spin, the faces of the crowd blurring into a vortex of condemnation. "No, you don't understand," he pleaded, his eyes darting around for an ally, for a single sympathetic face, and finding none. "I'm the regional manager for Platinum Fashion. I have responsibilities. I have authority here." Had authority. The new voice was deep, resonant, and carried an instantaneous, chilling weight. It sliced through the air, and the crowd, as if sensing the arrival of a new, more powerful predator, instinctively parted. An elegantly dressed man in his late 50s, with silvering temples and a face carved from granite, strode into the circle. His suit was bespoke, his demeanor one of effortless command. Even the police officers seemed to straighten up slightly in his presence. "Mr. Crawford," Richard breathed, his voice coming out as a strangled croak. The blood in his veins turned to ice water. James Crawford was the executive vice president of North American operations for Platinum Fashion. He was not just Richard's direct boss. He was a titan within the company, a man whose whims could make or break careers with a single, tersely worded email. He was corporate royalty, Richard Crawford said, his voice as cold and unforgiving as the Arctic ice. He didn't even look at Richard. His eyes were scanning the scene, taking in the police, the crowd, and the sea of smartphones. "I have just received, in the last 5 minutes, no fewer than 7 frantic calls. Calls from board members, from major shareholders, from my own CEO. Calls about an incident involving one of our senior managers physically assaulting a customer, in public." He finally turned his gaze on Richard, and it was with a look of such profound contempt that Richard physically flinched. Crawford gestured with a flick of his wrist at the recording phones. "An incident that, I am told, is currently being broadcast live across half of the social media platforms in Beverly Hills." Before Richard could even begin to formulate a defense, David stepped forward. He moved with a relaxed confidence that was in stark contrast to the frantic, panicked energy radiating from everyone else. He extended his hand to the formidable Mr. Crawford, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. It was a smile that made Richard's stomach plummet into a bottomless abyss. "James," David said, his voice warm, familiar, collegial. "Good to see you, though I sincerely wish it were under more pleasant and less percussive circumstances." Crawford's entire demeanor shifted. The icy corporate fury melted away, replaced by a look of genuine respect, deference, and something that looked terrifyingly like concern. He took David's hand and shook it firmly, his other hand coming up to clasp David's arm. "David," Crawford said, his voice laced with an urgency that bordered on panic. "My God, are you all right? When I got the call when they told me one of our employees had assaulted you, I couldn't believe it. I am so sorry." Richard watched, his mind refusing to process the scene. He was trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. His boss, the formidable James Crawford, was treating this man in the cheap sneakers and faded jeans not as an equal, but as a superior, as someone to be placated, to be appeased. "Mr. Crawford," Richard tried desperately to intervene, to reclaim some sliver of control over the narrative that was spiraling into oblivion. "You don't understand the situation. This man, he was trying to force his way into our store without the proper profile. He was aggressive. He was—" "Shut up, Richard." Crawford didn't shout the words. He growled them, a low gut command that vibrated with pure, unadulterated fury. He turned on Richard, and for the first time, Richard saw genuine fear in his boss's eyes. Not fear of Richard, but fear of what Richard had done. "You have no idea, do you?" Crawford hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You clueless, arrogant fool. You just publicly assaulted David Williams. He said the name as if it were a sacred incantation, a name that should have stopped Richard in his tracks, a name that should have been accompanied by trumpets and a celestial choir. David Williams. Richard. The name was spoken with such a mixture of reverence and horror that a fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Who was David Williams? The question was a palpable thing, hanging in the air. David maintained his calm expression, but Catherine, standing by his side, could see the glint of wry amusement in his eyes. He was not enjoying Richard's destruction, but he was certainly taking a grim satisfaction in the complete and utter dismantling of the man's prejudiced worldview. Crawford, his face pale and slick with sweat, took a step closer to Richard, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, terrified whisper that was somehow more intimidating than his shouting. Richard, you didn't just assault a customer, you assaulted the CEO and founder of Williams Tech Solutions. The name landed in the silence. For a moment it meant nothing to the crowd, but to Richard, it was the sound of the executioners. Axe Williams Tech Solutions, the company that had just signed a landmark deal with Platinum Fashion 6 months ago. Crawford continued, spelling out the apocalypse for Richard, each word another nail in his coffin. The company that provides our entire global systems infrastructure, our point-of-sale systems, our inventory management, our payment processing, our state-of-the-art cybersecurity. He paused, letting the weight of the information sink in, letting Richard truly appreciate the scale of his blunder. Williams Tech Solutions, Richard, the company that holds a 5-year exclusive, global contract with us, a contract that is worth $47 million. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. It was the silence of a black hole, sucking all sound, all light, all hope from Richard's universe. He felt his legs finally give way. He stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the back of a nearby food court chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor in a heap. Impossible, Richard muttered, shaking his head in denial. No, he was dressed like a normal person doing some weekend shopping. David supplied gently, his voice devoid of malice, which somehow made it worse. A strange concept, isn't it, Richard? The idea that a person's worth isn't stitched onto the label of their shirt. Marcus, the security guard who had been a silent, horrified witness to the entire saga, finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his expression one of profound apology. Mr. Williams, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sir, I am so sorry. If I had known who you were. David turned to Marcus, and his entire demeanor softened. He gave the older man a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Marcus, he said kindly, you have absolutely nothing to apologize for. You were in a difficult position. In fact, you have shown more professionalism, more decency, and more basic human dignity in the last 20 minutes than your boss has likely shown in his entire career. Crawford, meanwhile, had pulled out his own phone and was dialing frantically, his thumb shaking. I need to call the president. I need to get our PR team on this immediately. David, please, for the love of God, tell me we can fix this. Tell me we can make this right. James, David said, his voice calm and measured, the voice of a CEO discussing a business proposition. I'm not a vindictive person, you know that, but your employee, a senior representative of your company, did not just physically assault me. He did so based on a set of assumptions rooted purely in racial and class-based prejudice. He did it in public, in front of 100 cameras, while proudly proclaiming he was acting on behalf of your brand. He gestured to the phones, the silent, digital witnesses that were still recording. This isn't just about me anymore, James. This is about the message Platinum Fashion has just sent to the world. A message that says, if you look a certain way, you are not welcome here. You are, in fact, subject to physical violence. Catherine watched her husband of 15 years, completely and utterly break down in real time. The arrogant, confident man she thought she knew had been a fragile, hollow shell, and now that shell was shattered. The man revealed beneath was small, ugly, and pathetic. Richard, she said, her voice soft now, not with pity, but with a weary, final sadness. David isn't just my best friend. He's Sophie and Leo's godfather. He was there in the hospital when they were born. He helped me get my first job out of college, the one that eventually led me to the career I have now. Her voice broke, just slightly. How could you do this? How could you do this to him? One of the police officers stepped forward and placed a firm but gentle hand on Richard's arm. Sir, we need you to come with us. We have more than enough evidence and witness testimony to make an arrest for assault. Wait, Richard pleaded, his eyes wild with desperation. He twisted away from the officer and turned to David. his face a mask of pathetic, begging despair. "Please, Mr. Williams, David, please, you don't understand. I have a family, I have children, I have a career. This was all just a terrible, terrible misunderstanding." David studied him for a long, silent moment. His expression was inscrutable, his calm a deep, still ocean. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "Richard, I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. If I were really who you thought I was, a random black man with no money, no connections, no power, would you feel this same, desperate need to apologize right now?" The question hung in the air, a perfect, inescapable trap. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He struggled for a response, for a lie, for any word that could save him, but he found nothing. The truth was written all over his face, for everyone to see. "That's what I thought," David said softly. "You're not sorry that you did it, Richard. You're only sorry because you found out I could fight back. You're sorry for the consequences, not for the act itself. And that is the most damning thing of all." Crawford hung up his phone, his face the color of ash. "David," he said, his voice strained, "I've spoken with the president. Richard is, of course, terminated, effective immediately. His corporate accounts are being frozen as we speak. But about our contract." David smiled, and it was a smile that made Richard feel as if the floor had fallen away, leaving him plummeting into an infinite darkness. "James, it's interesting you should mention the contract," he said, his tone casual, conversational. "You see, I was actually on my way here today to meet with you later this afternoon. I was coming to discuss an early renewal of our agreement. In fact, I was going to propose an expansion of our services, a new AI-driven logistics platform. It would have effectively doubled the value of our deal." Richard's heart stopped. If Platinum Fashion lost the Williams Tech contract, it wouldn't just be his career that was over. It would be a corporate cataclysm. It would crater the stock price, lead to massive layoffs, and potentially bankrupt the company. "I've been giving it some thought," David continued, his gaze distant, as if weighing a complex equation. "But now I find myself having to seriously reconsider whether Williams Tech Solutions wants to continue its association with a company whose senior management finds it acceptable to physically assault potential customers based on the color of their skin." Crawford looked like he was on the verge of a massive coronary. "David, please," he begged. "This was a rogue employee, an aberration. His actions do not represent the values of our company. The company does not tolerate this kind of behavior." "The company promoted that rogue employee to regional manager," David observed coolly. "The company gave him the authority to represent its values in this territory. The company trained him, supervised him, and, I assume, gave him positive performance reviews for years." He paused, his eyes locking with Crawford's. "That makes me wonder, James. It makes me wonder what other rogue employees might be lurking in leadership positions within your organization. It's a risk assessment I now have to make." Richard Morrison finally understood. He finally grasped the full, horrifying magnitude of what he had done. In a single afternoon of unchecked arrogance, he had not only destroyed his own career and his own family, he had potentially crippled the entire company he worked for. He had jeopardized the livelihoods of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of his colleagues, all because he couldn't stand the sight of a black man in jeans. "Please," Richard whispered, tears finally welling in his eyes and tracing paths through the sweat on his cheeks. He turned to Catherine, his last, desperate hope. "I beg you, my children, our family, my wife." Catherine recoiled from him as if he were diseased. "Don't," she said, her voice laced with disgust. "Do not use me or our children as an excuse for your vile behavior." "Richard, what about our children? What am I supposed to tell them?" She paused, her eyes boring into his. "I suppose I will have to tell them the truth. That they deserve to know who their father really is." As the police officers finally, firmly, took Richard by the arms to lead him away, David did one last, unexpected thing. He stepped close to the man who had assaulted him, and spoke in a voice so quiet that only Richard could hear. "Richard," he said, not with anger, but with a strange, solemn finality, "I'm going to give you a piece of free advice. Don't waste this. Use this moment, this absolute rock bottom, to truly reflect on who you are and who you want to be. Because the person you revealed yourself to be today, that person isn't someone your own children should ever have to look up to." And as he was led away in handcuffs, through the crowd of staring faces and recording phones, the true, irreversible destruction Richard had wrought began to sink in. It wasn't the loss of his job, or his status, or even his freedom that crushed him. It was the sudden, soul-shattering understanding that he had lost something far more fundamental, his own family's respect. And that was a loss from which there could be no recovery. 6 months later, David Williams walked through the very same food court in the Beverly Center. The air was filled with the same smells, the same sounds, the same rhythm of commerce. But for David, the landscape was forever changed. He glanced over at the space that had once housed the gleaming platinum fashion boutique. It was now a dark, empty cavern, a for rent sign plastered across the dusty glass, a tombstone marking the grave of Richard Morrison's arrogance. The fallout had been swift and brutal. As David had predicted, the loss of the multi-million-dollar Williams Tech contract had been a death blow to Platinum Fashion's already struggling West Coast operations. The viral videos of the assault had become a PR nightmare from which the brand could not recover. The stock had plummeted. James Crawford had managed to save only a few of the downtown locations, but was forced to close 3 stores, including the Beverly Center flagship, laying off nearly 200 employees in the process. Richard Morrison, after pleading no contest to misdemeanor assault and serving a brief, humiliating stint of community service, discovered that the internet has a very long memory. The viral videos of his racist tirade and subsequent downfall had made him unemployable in the retail industry, or indeed, in any public-facing role. His name had become synonymous with corporate bigotry. Catherine had filed for divorce the week after the incident. She had sold their house and taken the children to live with her sister in Seattle, needing a fresh start, far away from the wreckage of her old life. "I can't look at you anymore, Richard," she had told him in their last, tearful phone call. "I can't look at you without seeing the face of the man who assaulted my best friend, the man who is godfather to our children." Marcus, the former security guard, was now the head of the security coordination team at the gleaming global headquarters of Williams Tech Solutions. He had a corner office, a salary triple his old one, and full health and dental insurance for his entire family for the first time in his life. "Mr. Williams gave me a chance," he would often tell his new, smiling colleagues, still in a state of disbelief at the sudden, miraculous turnaround in his fortunes. "He saw something in me when no one else, including my old boss, even bothered to see a human being." David stopped at the exact spot in the food court where Richard had punched him. He watched families of all races and backgrounds laughing, eating, and shopping together in peaceful, chaotic harmony. That single moment of ugly violence had paradoxically become a catalyst for immense good. His company, in partnership with his wife Elena's research foundation, had launched a new, heavily funded scholarship program. The Second Look Scholarship was designed to support young, underprivileged entrepreneurs from disadvantaged communities, the very type of person Richard Morrison had deemed unworthy of even entering his store. It was about turning a moment of personal pain into a lifetime of public opportunity. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a text message from Catherine. A picture was attached, showing their goddaughter, Sophie, grinning with a soccer trophy. The text below read, "David, thank you again for everything, for helping me see what I refused to see for 15 years. The kids miss their Uncle Dave. Are you still coming to Sophie's 10th birthday party next month?" David smiled, a genuine, warm smile of deep affection. He typed back his reply, "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Godfather's honor, always present." He put his phone away and continued his walk through the mall. He had learned a long time ago, on the unforgiving streets of his youth, that the best revenge wasn't about destruction. It wasn't about tearing down those who sought to hurt you. It was about building. It was about creating something so strong, so positive, so successful, that the small, petty hatreds of men like Richard Morrison would be rendered utterly insignificant, washed away by a rising tide of progress and grace. Richard had tried to humiliate him for his color and his clothes, but in the end, he had only succeeded in revealing his own impoverished soul to the entire world. For anyone who has ever faced the sting of prejudice or the burn of injustice, David's story served as a quiet, powerful reminder. Your dignity is your fortress, your integrity is your shield, and success, built on a foundation of character, is always the most eloquent and enduring response. The seeds of prejudice, sown in arrogance, will always, eventually, reap a harvest of consequences.